We're living in a time and place when we have drugified almost every aspect of our lives.
My name is Simon Wessely. I'm the Dean of the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neurosciences here at King's College London. And I'm delighted today that I'm talking to Professor Anna Lembke. Have I got your surname right, actually? Lembke?
Yeah, that's right. That works.
Oh, okay. Where's it from?
Actually German.
Ah, right. Well, I should know that. Okay. Same as my surname then. It's also German. Okay. Now, Anna is the chief of the Stanford Addictions Center at the University of Stanford, obviously in the dual diagnosis clinic there. But that's, well, I suppose partly why you're here, but you're really here because you've published, to the envy of everyone in academia, you published your book, Dopamine, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. I've got my copy here. Here you are, available in the paperback from all good bookshops, particularly the New York Times, where it's a bestseller. Right, so Anna, over in this country, we have a newspaper called The Sun, which is regarded, I don't know if you know it, but it's regarded as very, very tabloid, very, very popular. And a lot of people like us look down their noses at it, it has to be said. But what it did a couple of years ago, writing about a subject close to your heart, it said, the headline was this, it said, cupcakes could be as addictive as cocaine. And the reason for this was they cause a surge of the reward chemical dopamine to hit the decision-making area of the brain. So Anna, talk us through that, because I think, as the saying goes, it's a little bit more complicated than that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the Sun article, and I'm not familiar with that publication, but I think what it's getting at, is a core of something that is true, which is that our food supply has become drugified. And when I say drugified, what I mean is that it's been made more potent, which is to say it releases more dopamine in our brain's reward pathway. And dopamine is our pleasure and reward neurotransmitter. It's been made more accessible. One of the biggest risk factors for the development of addiction is simple access. If you live in a neighborhood where drugs are readily available on the street corner, you're more likely to try them and more likely to get addicted to them. And it's more bountiful. So we have this incredible supply chain where we can get cupcakes delivered to our doorstep, within half an hour. And those things, potency, access, quantity, and also, frankly, novelty, our ability to take something that's been reinforcing, change it slightly by adding a chemical moiety or changing the flavor or combining two flavors together, is what makes something a potential drug. And we're living in a time and place when we have drugified almost every aspect of our lives, which also means that we're vulnerable to compulsive overconsumption, leading into addiction in a way that is unprecedented in human history. We can today binge on almost anything, and we're proving ourselves very likely to do that.
What I noticed from looking at your extremely good reviews on Amazon and elsewhere, etc., though, is a number of people who are under the kind of impression that dopamine is itself an addictive drug. It's the pleasure chemical. I think another newspaper described it. But I wanted just to explore a bit, because that's not quite the case, is it? It's not the same as heroin, to which sometimes some people compare it with. It's a rather different, well, for one thing, without dopamine, none of us would be alive.
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes people say to me, I'm addicted to dopamine. And I say to them, no, you can't be addicted to dopamine.
Yeah.
Dopamine is the chemical signal that's essential for our reflexive tendency to approach pleasure and avoid pain. But it's much more complex, even just than pleasure. So, for example, there's a very famous experiment in which rats were engineered to have no dopamine receptors in the dedicated reward pathway. And what the researchers discovered is if they put food in that rat's mouth, it would eat the food and seem to get pleasure from the food, as much as you can measure that in a rat. But if they put the food even a body length away, the rat would starve to death. And the interpretation of that has been that dopamine is not just essential for pleasure, it's also essential for motivation. And the way that it gets us motivated to do the work, to go get our reward, is its modulations through time. So we're always releasing dopamine at baseline tonic levels in the brain. It's kind of like the heartbeat of the brain. And it's the fluctuations in dopamine firing, either above baseline or below baseline, which influence how we feel, whether or not we're motivated to do that thing again. In general, intoxicants release a lot of dopamine or increase dopamine firing all at once in the reward pathway, followed by dopamine free fall, not just to baseline, but actually below baseline. That's the hangover, the come down, the blue Monday, during which we are extremely motivated to consume more of that drug again, just to bring those levels back up to baseline. Because one of the overarching physiologic drivers of all living organisms is to return to homeostasis. Homeostasis, in this case, characterized by those baseline tonic levels, whatever our resting set point is for experiencing pleasure and pain. It's important to recognize that drug of choice is a very important additional layer to this. So what may increase dopamine firing in one person's brain may not do so, or may not do so to the same extent in another person's brain. So for example, when we think about people doom scrolling and people who get addicted to watching the news, well, you think to yourself, well, what's the deal? I thought dopamine was our pleasure neurotransmitter. It's not that. It's that for certain individuals, unique wiring, aversive stimuli might actually be reinforcing. Also, dopamine is the neurotransmitter of novelty, even separate from whether the stimulus is pleasurable or painful. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that tells us something is happening that's really important and key for your survival, and you need to pay attention to it.
Okay, so it's neither good nor bad, is it? To say, you can't kind of characterize in the way that you might cocaine or heroin, and the increases that you get with both opioids and cocaine are, thousands, I don't know thousands, but massively larger than what happens when you are gambling or watching porn. I'll come on to that because it's the opening of your book, obviously. Well, not obviously, but if you've read it, it's obvious. And eating junk food, etc. So we're talking about orders of magnitude difference, aren't we?
Well, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Because the truth is that it's very difficult to measure absolute levels of dopamine in the human brain. We are basing much of this on rat studies where we put a probe. I'm using the royal we here. I am not a neuroscientist. I'm not in the lab doing these experiments. My wonderful colleagues do this amazing work. So just take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, fair enough.
Neuroscientists are putting a probe into the reward pathway of a rat's brain and measuring dopamine firing levels above baseline in response to certain stimuli. So for example, in a rat, eating chocolate increases dopamine firing about 50% above baseline. Nicotine is about 200%. Amphetamine, cocaine is about 1,000%. So, you have these gradations, but rats are not humans, right? In fact, it's very difficult to get a rat addicted to alcohol unless you specifically engineer a strain of rats to get addicted to alcohol. And when we're talking about absolute levels, what we know for sure is that things like gambling, pornography, social media, video games, we know that they increase dopamine firing in the reward circuitry of the brain. So the same chemicals or intoxicants that we think of, drugs and alcohol, these process addictions or digital media, they stimulate the same part of the brain. What we don't know is whether it's more or less than these classic intoxicants. And I would hypothesize or speculate that it 100% depends on the individual. So for some individuals, opioids, which we think of as highly addictive, may not actually increase dopamine levels very much in a given human, whereas pornography might just, send it out of the roof. Okay.
Now that begs the question. We know that lots and lots of people gamble. They, have their weekly lottery tickets and whatever it is. Nearly all males watch pornography. It turns out most females as well. But, only of the people who play games, only about 2 to 3% will become something that looks like a gambling addiction or a video games addiction, etc. why don't the other 95% of people go the same way? Whereas opioids are far, far more addictive than that, aren't they?
Okay, so a couple key points here. The first is when we're talking about the relative addictive nature of substances or behaviors, we need to really be clear that access matters. So when you look at, for example, the rates of addiction to alcohol or nicotine or cannabis all over the globe, you see much higher rates of addiction for those substances because they're mostly legal, or in many countries they're legal. So they're very, very accessible, right? Whereas drugs like LSD in the United States are so far not legal, you're not supposed to be obtaining them easily. Right now, because we have a trope around LSD and psychedelics being treatment for depression or allowing for a spiritual awakening, people are using them a lot more. And as there's increased access, we are seeing increased rates of psychedelic addiction, harms due to psychedelics. So this is really, really important to think about. That we can't just look at the rates in the population without also accounting for the prevalence or availability of the drug.
All right, but in defense of the younger generation, which obviously I'm not part of, one thing that's been very clear in both the US and the UK, and I imagine many other countries as well, is that despite the easy availability, which gets cheaper and cheaper every year, in fact, of things like alcohol, and I don't think it's very hard to get drugs, I'm told, yet the rates in young people in the last decade or more have been steadily going down. So rather, and that's because I'm an epidemiologist, so I have no idea why, but I do know that they are going down.
Yeah.
And which kind of goes against this idea that this is all the fault of society. There's just too much of everything and people just indulge and have got no self-control anymore. But so why are you thinking less needed?
So let me say, I didn't get to finish answering your question.
Okay.
Part of it is the ecosystem. And I can tell you the rates of alcohol addiction and cannabis addiction are going way up in the United States. So we are seeing that our epidemiologic findings correlate with increased access. And I think in general, it's pretty well confirmed that the more access you have to an addictive substance, the more you're going to see harms, including the harm of addiction. We can use online sports betting as another example here in the United States. That's been illegal for, until some years ago. And in the states where online sports betting is now legal, there have been 300 to 500% increases in calls to hotlines for pathological gambling. Okay, but that argument aside, let's look at the general vulnerability. So only about 10 to 15% of individuals who consume alcohol will go on to develop an alcohol use disorder. So the vast majority of people who drink alcohol don't become addicted to alcohol. So there we have a lot of different factors going on. I think the biopsychosocial conceptualization of mental illness is really key here, which is to say we have biological contributors to vulnerability, psychological contributors, and then social or environmental contextual contributors. We know pretty well, if you look at family studies and adoption studies, that if you have a biological parent or grandparent with an alcohol addiction, you are at increased risk to develop an alcohol addiction yourself compared to the general population, even if you are raised outside of that alcohol consuming home. It's not going to be one gene, it's a complex polygenic phenomenon, but clearly, and in my clinical work, it's very clear that there are some people who are born with what used to be called the addictive personality. We don't use that terminology anymore. We now talk about people who have vulnerability to the disease of addiction. These are people who can get addicted to almost anything, or even if they have a particular drug of choice, they become almost instantly enslaved by it because of the particular nature of their brain circuitry as part of their biological contributors. Now, when we look at psychological contributors, there's lots of things. We know that poverty, unemployment, multi-generational trauma, abuse, ongoing stressors, all of that increases the risk of addiction. It turns out if you have parents who either implicitly or explicitly condone substance use as recreational fun or a coping strategy, those kids are more likely to get addicted. Conversely, if you have a parent who's a helicopter parent, who knows where their kid is, what's in their backpack, what's under their bed, those kids are less likely to get addicted, and on and on and on. So you can find.
Come on to that in a minute, actually. I just wonder, though, if you want to say, why just levels of drinking, not addiction, but levels of drug and alcohol consumption are going down in youth. I mean, that's unequivocal. Whether or not you had any thoughts as why that might be when your hypothesis, of the age of indulgence, they're not indulging as much as certainly I did. And I don't know about you, Anna, but.
Well, okay. So, I mean, this is purely hypothetical, but my sense is that they've switched, those vulnerable youth have basically switched those tendencies to digital media. And now you've got, and we're seeing this, rising rates of really video game addiction, very surprisingly youthful pornography addiction, social media addiction, all of it, YouTube, more and more kids coming in. And a lot of times people push back and say, well, you can't really be addicted to a behavior. Trust me, you can. These are kids are coming morbidly depressed, non-functional, in some cases suicidal. They're consuming, 14, 16, 20 hours a day of digital media. And when we do an intervention, right? So what we see is some degree of dose dependency, which is one of the ways that we look at causality. If you look at most of the studies around digital media, social media, and psychiatric harms, what you see is tons of correlation. So the more people consume digital media, the more likely they are to be depressed, anxious, insomniac, etc. So, okay, but what's the chicken and the egg? Were they depressed, so they went online more? Were they went online more, they were depressed? We see it when we see it. To try to tease that apart, one of the things we can do is look at, well, obviously the temporal sequence, but that's harder because that's usually retrospective. But we can look at the dose influence. So is it that the more they use, the more depressed they are? And we do see some signs of that. But even more importantly, from my perspective, when we do a clinical intervention and we take digital media away from these kids for a long enough period of time to reset reward pathways, they get better without our having to do any other intervention. No psychotherapy, no special medication. So these kids are like emerging from this trance, which looks very like the way that people emerge from, acute withdrawal from addictive substances.
Okay, let me just explore that a little bit more, because now you're moving on to the treatments that you give, the advice you give, and management, and obviously you are advocating, everything in moderation or balance, which seems very sensible. And your sex addicted engineer, was it? I'm not entirely sure, with his machine. And I won't spoil the fun for everyone else by saying what that was. You told him to destroy the machine, or your highly anxious cannabis smoking young woman, told her to try a month without weed, all of which seems excellent advice. But you actually used the word reduce your dopamine, or I think you did, or in your book you do. And one quote I noted, you said the smartphone is the modern day hypodermic needle delivering digital DA, digital dopamine 24 hours a day. And I just wondered, how much of that is you using things in a metaphorical way to do what is obviously sensible to reduce your drug intake, to get rid of the pleasure machine that your engineer developed, etc. But you're using a kind of scientific metaphor in order to explain this to a patient who may not particularly like it if you'd use standard behavior therapy or CBT or something like that. But you put it into neuroscientific terms, which makes it more acceptable.
Absolutely. And it's explicitly, it's explicitly metaphorical.
Push back on that one.
Right. No, I'm not going to push back. It is explicitly metaphorical. I use through many chapters in the book the metaphor of a pleasure-pain balance, like a teeter-totter or a seesaw in a kid's playground, to represent how we process pleasure and pain, the come down that we get after intoxication, how that come down or that dopamine deficit state is what drives reuse in order to restore a level balance or homeostasis. So this is a way to distill complex neuroscience to, the point that we understand what's going on, into a kind of portable image of what is happening in our brains, or what is likely happening in our brains, that people can take with them as they, enter the world and make decisions. So for example, I use the process of neuroadaptation, or the efforts of the brain to try to restore homeostasis, as represented by these little neuroadaptation gremlins that hop on the pain side of the balance. And to give you an example of how that lands for some people, I had a guy who was trying to quit smoking, and he said, every time I get a craving for a cigarette, I just imagine that those little neuroadaptation gremlins are jumping up and down on the pain side of my balance, trying to get me to smoke again. So I think that's that kind of metaphorical representation of complex neuroscience can be very helpful for people. I will also say that what's exciting to me about a lot of the neuroscience that we're seeing now is that it actually is an echo of what philosophers and theologians have been saying for centuries, but now we have neuroscience to show it. And I can tell you that if I say to, my patient, Epicurus said X or Jesus said Y, they're not that interested. But if I say, hey, neurons, neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, all of a sudden I've got their attention.
Oh, that's a wonderful. That gives me a wonderful way in just to try a little game with you. Okay, just just a quick one. It's very simple. But when would you? I wonder if you can get the author here, which is probably a bit difficult, but maybe the time. So this is from a book that I'm very fond of, and he's talking. It is a he, and he says the greatest curse brought down on us by technology is that it prevents us from escaping from the present, even for a brief time. No one has any time to think anymore. You want to have a guess when that was?
George Orwell?
You're pretty close, actually. It's actually Stefan Zweig, but writing at exactly the same time. You're quite a Huxley person, aren't you? Rather than
yes, right. I was going to guess Aldous next.
Yes, yeah, but actually it's Stefan Zweig. But he's actually writing about the decline of the end of the Habsburg Empire from his exile in Brazil in 1942. It was the last thing he wrote. He sent it to his publisher and committed suicide the next day. But again, blaming technology, blaming the medium for the message is what I'm getting at here. How much are we doing that? When new technologies come in, we have a tendency to say they are responsible. The new and particularly people our generation have that tendency to say that thing that we don't do, but others do, children do, young people do, is a bad thing, without really fully understanding.
Sure. I mean, going back to the idiot box, which is how, my father talked about television, contrasted with, entertaining ourselves to death. I mean, obviously, there are so many amazing things about the technology. This conversation we're having now, which is really fun for me, would not be able to happen without this incredible technology linking us together. But I do think that it's very clear that we are at a point where we need to talk about the dark sides of the technology. We're not putting the genie back in the bottle. We're not getting rid of, this amazing digital technology, the internet, et cetera, nor would we want to. But clearly, when we have 5-year-olds who are viewing pornography on their iPads, we have a very serious problem that we individually and collectively need to sort out. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, we can all identify, even in our own lives, a substance or behavior that we consume more of, more frequently, and in ways that are harmful to self and others than we would like. And I'm very open about my particular compulsive behaviors in the book, but I do that in part because I feel like it's low risk in the sense that I know that I'm not alone.
Fair enough. I was going to ask you about the book, the Plug-in Drug, Television, Children of the Family, which is 50 years old now, but quite a bit of it is similar to what you're writing, but it was about TV, but you've already talked about your father and beaten that one. So fair enough. So let's move on a little bit then. You are talking about, and I quote here, an over-sanitized and over-pathologized children. The notion that children, you take issue with the notion that children are uniquely vulnerable. And you say that by protecting our children from adversity, we have made them deadly afraid of it. Now, I absolutely couldn't agree with you more on that. It's not a common view that many have, but riff on it a bit more and tell me why you came to this.
Sure. Well, I mean, this is, I've been practicing psychiatry now for 25 years, and it's been a very clear progression, over that time period. And I live here in the heart of Silicon Valley. We have very many privileged and wealthy people. We are seeing more and more people, including young people, who actually construct their entire identity around their psychiatric diagnosis. So, for example, I went to speak to a local high school. I met with sort of the leaders of the school. They were to go around and introduce themselves. And the first was like, I'm Sally, I have OCD. I'm Bob, I have depression. So we've really, we now use this kind of medicalization framework to understand ourselves. We identify the locus of the problem as a disease process within our brains, for better and for worse. And parenting has been absolutely consumed with the idea that if we do anything to traumatize our children, even by gently pushing back on things they may not want to do, we will cause them trauma, which leaves a kind of literal psychic scar, which then sets them up for future pain in the form of post-traumatic stress disorder, all of which has parents scrambling around this notion they need to make their children more comfortable. They need to make sure they get them to a psychiatrist, get them diagnosed, get their depression treated. So we've completely and radically 180 degrees reoriented on the experience of pain, suffering, struggling, distress, unhappiness, to the point where we can now consider pain in any form to be dangerous. And it is the job of parents and of psychiatrists and psychologists and teachers and camp counselors to make sure that kids are not experiencing any distress. And as a result, I believe we are doing a huge disservice to these kids because we are making them feel as brittle as glass, that they can't actually go anywhere without potentially experiencing some kind of triggered harm. And instead, and this is really not, these are not new ideas, but these are ideas that I think are especially imminent and pressing for our time, and they're getting worse. Instead, obviously, what we should be doing is inviting pain into our lives, intentionally seeking it out, because we live in this rarefied world where we're insulated from pain. We should be encouraging our kids to struggle. We as parents should not seek primarily to be our children's friends, but instead to be providing the guardrails and the realistic feedback that they're going to need to be successful in their adult lives. That's the other thing. It's very difficult to get realistic feedback now. So, for example, in academia, when we write recommendation letters, nobody's willing to put anything bad or negative in a recommendation. You could literally get sued if that person then discovers you and thwarted their chances.
I can see where you're going with that one, Anna. And my father once wrote someone a reference, said, Dr. So-and-so has been with us for 7 years and has been in excellent health throughout. And that was all he would say. Now then, can I thank you once again for coming and wish you luck and look forward to your next book.
Thank you, Simon. It was great.
Okay.